Hello and welcome to another pen video from me, Penultimate Dave. So I have another inks comparison video here, and this is brown inks comparison number 4. So I think with that, let's swab up some of these inks. So I get a lot of questions on how I do these ink videos. So I decided I would add this to the front of each of the ink videos. I put links in the description, but I know some of you watch this on TVs or mobile devices, so you don't get to see this. So first off, the paper is the number one question I get asked. What paper do I use for these ink comparison videos? So this is the original Tomoe River. This is 52 GSM, and it is the white, not the cream, the white. Where possible, I try to go for the white because the cream can actually change the color of the ink just a little bit. So this is Tomoe River 52 GSM in the white. A lot of people get confused as well because I have what looks to be a grid on this page, and it's actually an Oxford Optik pad. These are the pads that I actually use when I'm writing my writing samples for pen reviews or in my currently ink. So they have these little squares up here. I just use that because it's a good guide for me when I put this very thin sheet of Tomoe River over. I can actually see squares, so it helps me write a little bit sort of straight on the page. Not always, but sometimes it does. The other thing that I also have is I have a bottle of water, plain water, and I dip my nib in here. So for consistency, I use the same fountain pen, or I guess it's not a fountain pen, it's using a fountain pen nib though. This is a 3D printed pen from William Shakour in the UK. So he prints this material 3D, and it has a number 8 size Bock nib which I can unscrew, and you can see there. So it is just a dip pen holder for a number 8 size Bock nib, and the idea is I want to have consistency with the writing sample. So I use this, I dip it in the ink, I write, and then I will dip it in here and I will rinse the nib off several times and I will dry it, and then at that point I will then go on to do the next ink swatch and the next writing sample. So there you have it. That's how I do my ink swatches. So I just wanted to show you that here. Now on to the ink comparison video. So the first ink we're going to swab up today is Pilot Iroshizuku in a Hoe. So we'll do an ink swatch here. Now some of you will say that this is more of a goldish ink. I typically do use this more as a gold color ink, but it is still considered a brown ink. You can see it's getting quite light towards where the ink is drying out there. We'll do a second pass, and this is just to denote the difference really between a wet versus a dry writing nib. Try and show some of the shading properties of the ink in the pulled areas, and also to see if we can get any sheening as well. Although I'd have to say typically you don't normally see a lot of sheening, if any sheening, on a brown coloured ink, although it is always possible. Never say never. So this is Pilot Iroshizuku, and this is Inner Hoe, which, if you like this ink, I'd implore you to go and get it if you can from a retailer now, because this ink has been discontinued. I did pick up a second bottle. I'd already gone through one bottle of this ink and I picked up a second bottle. So I now have 2 bottles plus the 1.5, and this is essentially half of bottles. So I've got 1.5 bottles remaining of Inner Hoe, but it is an ink I do like a lot. The next ink here is a Herbin, and it's Ambre de Birmanie. And yes, I know this is not the bottle it should come in. I absolutely hate with a vengeance the small Herbin D-size bottles. You cannot get a number 6 size nib in there once you've probably used about half a converter of ink from the bottle. So I had decanted several of the bottles into a 60ml Akamon bottle. So yes, it's not the original bottle, but it's the original ink. So we'll do an ink swatch. And this is still an interesting ink. It's an ink that I used to write with a lot, and I think I had bought about 3 bottles of it. And I'd used one. And it's an ink I haven't actually used much lately. So we've done a second pass again to show the wet versus dry, and also to try and pick up some of the shading there as well. I know a lot of people ask me that question, why do you do a second pass? And that's purely the reason behind it. Most reviewers don't do that, and I just think that they're missing a beat if they don't do it. So this is Herbin. Should be a B. Getting ahead of myself. And this is Ambre de, and it's Birmanie. But this is actually quite a nice golden brown. So if you're looking for a light golden brown color ink, then definitely do check out this ink. I have found it a little bit dry in some pens. In other pens, it's been perfectly fine if it's a wet writing nib. If you're writing with an extra fine or fine, you may not like this unless you really want a dry ink. I do find some of the Herbin inks are a little dry, although I do have Lait de Tay and Lait de Tay, strangely enough, I do not find to be a dry ink. The next ink is Diamine Sepia. So we'll do another ink swatch here. And this definitely is a sepia color. Again, another light brown. Now, do you like light browns or do you like dark browns? Typically, I have preferred dark brown inks, but I've started to gravitate more towards lighter brown. So again, we'll do a second pass over the top here, see if we can find some shading there in that ink. And this is Diamine. And it is sepia. But that also, if you're liking a light brown or a golden brown color, then definitely do check that out. That is a nice blend of colors. The next ink is Diamine Ochre. So we'll do another ink swatch here. Now, a lot of people ask, is there a replacement ink for Akamon SBRE Brown? Well, Akamon SBRE Brown is actually made by Diamine. And we'll just do a second pass here over the top half. And the interesting thing about Diamine Ochre is in the lightest area. So if you're writing with a dry writing nib, then you will find, or even maybe an extra fine or fine nib, you will find this to be an almost identical match. If you are writing with a wet nib, it may not be as close, but it's pretty good comparison. So this is Diamine, and it's ochre. And I think I did do a comparison on one of my videos between the two inks at one point. So go and check that one out if you can find it. The next ink is Pelikan Edelstein, and it's Smoky Quartz. So we'll do an ink swatch. Now this was an ink of the year, I think it may have been 2017, 2018. And I panic bought 2 bottles of it, and I was then regretting it ever since. Just do a second pass on the top here. And the reason why I regretted it is because I'd inked it up in a couple of pens, and I'd actually found it was a very dry writing ink, at least for me in the pens that I'd put it in, and I just didn't like the color, and I found it also because it was more of a drier ink for me on those nibs. It was giving me a bit more feedback to those nibs as well. However, I've tried it. I think I left it about a year or two, and then I tried it in some wetter writing nibs, and I was amazed by how good this ink wrote. So sometimes you do just need to try it in a completely different type of pen or different nib, and you may be surprised. So this is Pelikan, Edelstein, and it's Smoky, and it's Quartz. But it can be a nice brown ink. It's a little bit on the darker side though compared to these other browns here, but it is still a nice colour of ink. Now, the last one here is Pilot Iroshizuku Tsukushi, and yes, I know this hasn't got the label. I actually had a bit of an accident. I dropped this in its box at one point. The cap cracked and leaked all over the label, so I actually removed the label and put this label on instead. Now, Pilot Iroshizuku Tsukushi is another ink I think Pilot have discontinued as well. So if you want this, try and pick it up fairly soon. So this is, we'll do an ink swatch here. Tsukushi translates to horse's tail. And I have to say, this is a little bit more of a, I want to say a chestnut colour. We'll do a second pass over here, over the top. We'll try and show some shading there if we can. So this is Pilot Iroshizuku, and it is Tsukushi. But that is quite a nice brown ink, and I still use this in a few pens. It's an ink that I do go to somewhat regularly. So I think now let's take a look at these inks in a little bit more detail now that they have dried. So the first ink we have here is Pilot Iroshizuku in a Ho. And I know some of you are going to say this isn't a brown coloured ink. Technically Pilot do or have listed this as a brown ink in the past. Certainly a lot of retailers do. It is to me a little bit more of a goldish colour, although it's still typically in the browns. So you can see here a huge difference between a wet or broad and a dry and narrow writing nib. There is quite a lot of shading on this as well, and I will show you close up the ink here. Is there any sheen on this ink? Typically you don't normally see a lot of sheen on brown inks, and I don't really see that here. Now I think if I'm right in remembering, Pilot Iroshizuku in a Ho has now been discontinued. So if you do want to get that ink, you want a nice golden colour ink, then try and pick this up before it's sold out. Another good ink, which I'm starting to like a little bit more, is KWZ Old Gold. That is another nice golden ink, and I always thought that this looked more golden than KWZ Old Gold. However, more lately I've actually done a 180, and now I think KWZ Old Gold looks more golden in a Ho. But that may be just me. The next ink here is Herbin Ambre de Birmanie, which is a beautiful, almost sunsetty brown. It's an autumn brown. There is autumn oak as well, and that's, I think, a Diamine ink. But this one is, again, somewhat similar, I guess. But this is a beautiful sunset. So you can see a difference between wet and dry, although it's pretty much blended into a beautiful sunset. You can also see quite a bit of shading going on there in that ink. The writing sample is on the darker side because this is a wet writing nib. And I think let's take a look at the ink swatch here in a little bit more detail. I'm not seeing any sheen there on that ink swatch or on the writing sample, but it does have a fair amount of shading. The next ink is Diamine Sepia. Now, I do typically find this one being a little bit more on the dry side. You can see the difference between a wet and a dry writing nib. There is a little bit of shading going on, not a huge amount. There isn't a lot of shading, I'd say, in the writing sample as well. We'll take a little bit more of a closer look here. Is there any sheen? I would say no to that. At least maybe slightly, but very, very little, if anything. So again, it's not really a sheening ink. The next ink here is Diamine Ochre, and I did say that this, for me, is quite a close comparison to Akamon SBRE Brown, which is actually made by Diamine. So this is quite an interesting colour. You can see the difference between a wet and a dry writing nib. I'm not seeing as much sort of shading going on here in the writing sample. There's not a huge amount of shading in the ink swatch, but let me take a closer look and you will hopefully see some goldish sheen around here and around the top here. It's subtle sheen and it's quite a lot of sheen, but you do see that. So although brown inks typically do not sheen much, this one does a little. The next ink is Pelikan Edelstein Smoky Quartz, and I found in the early days that this, with a dry, a Yovo writing nib, which are typically fairly dry, I noticed that this actually was too dry as an ink. More recently, I found putting it in a wet writing nib actually transforms it. It does make it very, very dark, almost like a black colour. Now, you can definitely see the difference between a wet and a dry, or a broader or a narrower nib. The ink sample here is just a little bit still wet. It does have some sheen there. It's trying to sheen. It's not, I'd say it's not quite able to do so. There is some sheen though, at least I can see it off camera. And then the last ink here, which also is still a little bit wet here, is Pilot Iroshizuku Tsukushi. And again, you can see the difference between a wet or a broad versus a dry or a narrow writing nib. There isn't a huge amount of shading. The reason being is that this one has a lot of sheen going on there. So you can hopefully see that the sheen is mostly, I would say, on the wetter portion of that ink swatch. There is a little bit on the writing sample, not a huge amount though, but it typically tends to be where ink is pulled more on the page. So there you have it. That's my brown inks comparison number 4 video. If there are any of these inks that you like, let me know in the comments below. Likewise, if there are any inks that are very close to these or that you would like compared in a future video, then do let me know in the comments below. So that's my brown inks comparison number 4 video. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next pen video. Bye bye.